In this tutorial, you're going to learn everything you need to know to connect and configure an in-memory H2 database in Spring Boot. I'm also going to walk you through what you need to look out for if you include Spring Security in your application. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Dan Vega, and I'm a Spring developer advocate for VMware. I've done some videos in the past on H2, but I thought it was time for a little bit of a refresher, along with adding in this Spring Security bit. So let's not waste any time and let's jump in and start writing some code. We're going to start this tutorial like we do every other tutorial by heading over to our favorite website, start.spring.io. We're going to create a Maven project using Java, using the latest version of Spring Boot, which at the time of this recording is 2.7.3. We're going to fill in some metadata about the project. We're going to call this an H2 demo, and everything else looks pretty good. And now we need our dependencies. So we're going to use Spring Web to create a Spring MVC project. We're obviously going to need the H2 database, so we're going to select that as a dependency. And then we also need we actually need an underlying dependency called Spring Jdbc, but that isn't a dependency that you just add, but you can get it transitively through some other dependencies, one of which is Spring Data JPA or Spring Data JDBC. So I'm going to choose Spring Data JDBC. We are also going to talk about security, but I don't want to add security yet. We'll add those bits later after we've kind of gone through an introduction. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and click Generate, download a zip. You can open it up in whatever text editor ID you're most productive in. All right, so I have the project open in IntelliJ. I just want to go ahead and take a look at the POM. So we are using 2.7.3. We are using Java 17. And if we look at the dependency Spring Boot Starter Data JDBC, and we look at Spring Data JDBC, if we go all the way down, there should be a Spring JDBC artifact here, which there is. And so again, that is the bits that we need to get a data source configured for us. And it is transitively brought in through one of the Spring Data projects that we are going to bring in. And in this case, we're using Spring Data JDBC. So what I want to start out with is let's just run the application. And I want to start out by saying that without actually doing anything in your application, without actually configuring anything, Spring Boot has auto-configured an embedded data source for you. All right, and if I look down here in the console, I'll see some logging here under Hikari data source. So I see Hikari pool start completed. This is telling me that we have a data source configured and we have a Hikari data source, like an actual pool, set up and started for us. So if I want to dig into this a little bit further and just kind of examine what's going on here, I can. I'm going to go ahead and introduce a local variable here, and we'll call this context, like the application context. And what I want to do is just say from the context, go ahead and get me a bean. And I want to get the bean called data source. And so if I do that, I introduce a local variable that should be of type object. And if I go ahead and say, let's print this out, we'll say data source.get class. And actually, I don't even need to do that because the default should probably print that out. Let's go ahead and stop and rerun that. And you can see it is a Hikari data source. All right, so we know we have that Hikari data source. What I'm going to do is actually go into application.properties, and I'm going to go ahead and set logging level for com.zaxer, I think that's how you say it, .Hikari, and there is a Hikari config. I'm going to go ahead and set that to debug. Now, you don't need to do this. I'm just kind of pointing this out. I'm doing this to just kind of walk through and show us what's happening. So we know a data source is being configured for us, but we don't really know all the properties to it, right? Well, with this config turned on to debug, we get a really good glimpse into what is being configured for us. So we see we have this Hikari pool configuration. Here's all of the properties of that configuration. So here's our data source, which is none. We have a driver class name, so that is using the H2 driver. Here's a password that is masked. It has some like health check properties. Here's the Jdbc URL. So this is the one thing I wanted to really point out here is that by default, we are going to generate a unique name for that H2 database. So we have this really unique name going on here. and then just a whole bunch of other properties for that data source. You see the username is SA. So this is a good insight to find out the configuration of the data source that was set up for us. Now, again, we haven't done anything yet. We haven't set any properties. So what I'm going to do is actually turn that off, and I'm going to come in here, and I want to go ahead and set the H2 console to enabled. So with the H2 database, we get this really nice console that lets us kind of look into the database and introspect the tables and the columns, you know, a nice UI into the database. So we don't have to like do this from the command line or anything. We get this nice UI to take a look at. So let's go ahead and save that and then come back to our application. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this now. We don't really need this. We can get rid of this. We're not actually going to use this variable. And we're kind of back to our normal application. So let's go ahead and stop and rerun this. And now when I run this, since I have the H2 console on, you can see the H2 console is available at /H2 console. This is something that you can configure via the application.properties. You can change this, whatever you want this path to be. But it also tells us, hey, there's a database available at this particular URL. So if we wanted to, we can go ahead and grab that URL and head over to our browser. And if we go to localhost 8080 and then go to /H2 console, it's going to ask for a Jdbc URL. If we paste that one in there, the username is going to be SA, the password is going to be blank. We can test our connection, so we can see that it is successful, and now we can go ahead and connect to it. So now we're connected to this random name database that Spring Boot generated for us. There are no tables, there are no columns in any tables, just an empty schema at this point. So this is the console that gives us the UI into our database. So one other thing I want to point out that is if you don't set this, if you use something like Spring Boot DevTools provides a lot of sensible defaults. So if DevTools is on the class path, this will automatically get set for you, and you automatically can go in and check it out because it's just assuming, hey, you're in development mode, you probably want to see the H2 console, right? So if you see that, that's the reason for that. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is go ahead and turn off that randomly generated unique name. And so we can come in here and say generate unique name is equal to false. And so if we just do that and restart it, we will see that the default name for our database is going to be testdb. So if we were to log back into the H2 console, now we're going to log in with testdb. In this case, I want to go ahead and set my own data source name. So I'm going to say spring.datasource.name equals bookstore. So let's go ahead and restart that one more time. And now we should see that the H2 console is available and our database is available at bookstore. So this is the Jdbc URL. It's just saying, hey, this is an H2 in-memory database and the data source is bookstore. So let's go back to the browser. We're going to refresh this. And instead of this long name, we're just going to replace that with bookstore. Again, SA, no password. You could test it if you want or connect to it. We don't have any tables yet. Okay, so now we need a way to go ahead and create some schema, right? We need a schema, we need a table design, we need a way to go ahead and set that up and then add some data into the database. So I'm going to start under resources. We look for a file by a configuration called schema.sql. And what happens when you're using an embedded database, you don't need to configure anything else. We will automatically look for this script and run it. If you're using something like something closer to production, like a MySQL, a Postgres database, there is a setting you need to change to say, hey, init mode, I want you to go ahead and run this schema. But when it's an embedded database like H2, you don't need to set anything else. We're automatically going to look for that file and go ahead and run it. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and change the dialect. I'm going to go ahead and set this to H2. And it's also saying, hey, no data source is configured to run this SQL and provide advanced code persistence. So you could connect to a data source, but I'm going to go ahead and leave another video that I did Because this is an in-memory database, you can't actually have two connections to that in-memory database. So you can't really set that up here in IntelliJ. If you use something like a file, you can still use H2 for like a file mode. If you do it that way, you can connect to it here in IntelliJ. But what I'm going to do is just go ahead and say, I want you to, whoops, so I don't want to do that. I just want to suppress this, and it's not letting me right now, but no big deal. So we actually don't need to do that. What I want to do now is create my schema. So I'm going to say create a table called, and we're going to be working with books. We're going to close that off, and I'm going to say, let's go ahead and create an ID of type int, and we'll just use auto increment for that. We're going to have a title for our book. We'll have a varchar of 255, and we'll say this is not null. We'll have pages, the number of pages in the book. We'll just say not null for that. And finally, the author, we're just going to have a string of 255 and not null. Okay, so that's our schema. So now what happens is when we go ahead and rerun our application, let's try that now. Let's bring this back up and just say rerun. I don't see any indication that that table was created, but let's go back over to our H2 console and go ahead and test this out. We'll connect to it. And I'll look at that. I have a book table now. So you can kind of drill down into this and see that these are the columns. If you drill into here, you can see what the types are. If you click on this, you can go ahead and run a query that select star from book. And we have no data. We have no rows in this table right now, so it's going to bring back nothing at this point. So I want to revisit not being able to really see what was going on there. If we come back to our application.properties, I want to kind of look at that logging level again. So if I go to logging level, there is org.springframework.jdbc. If I go ahead and turn on debugging for that and restart my application, we should see some more information in here. And so we see our data source available, but now we see some things going on here. So first we can see it executed a SQL script from file, and we can see that that is schema.sql. We had 0 return from the update count. We do have a create table book, so it's showing us what was actually executed there. And we executed that script, fetching JDBC connection. Everything is ready to go. So I like having that property set while I'm in development here, just so I can kind of see what's going on. So now I need to get some data in there. So the first thing I could do is just come into this script. So this is a DDL script. It can create tables, and it can also insert data at the same time. So if I wanted to, I can go ahead and say insert into book. We'll say ID. Actually, we're not going to use an ID because that's auto-incremented. So we'll say title, pages, author. Our values are Spring Boot, up and running. The number of pages is 328, and the author is my good friend Mark Heckler. So with that, we can go ahead and rerun our application, and let's see if we see anything else here in the logging. And we see that we are creating that table, but now we also see the one returned as an update count for SQL. And here's that insert statement that we ran. So let's head back over to the browser, refresh our H2 console, and log into here and go ahead and run the SQL. And boom, there is our row that we inserted into the database. So the other thing is you can always run SQL in the H2 console as well. So let's go ahead and comment this out. I'm going to save that. I'm going to refresh this. If we go back over to the H2 console and go ahead and load that up, you can see if we look at book, there is no books. This will go ahead and run any SQL. So I'm going to just run some SQL in here and say run. And you can see there's an update count of 1. So if I clear this and now click on book and run that, we have our record inserted into the database that way. All right, so that was one way to get data in. I'm not a huge fan of writing SQL. I'd much rather write some Java code to make this happen. So we're going to do a few things here. I'm going to start over here, and I'm going to create a package called model. I'm going to create a new package called controller. And I'm going to create a new package called repository. And so in my model, I'm going to create a new class. We're going to call this book. This is going to be a record. So this is going to kind of line up with our database columns. So I'm going to have an integer of ID, a string title, a integer pages, and a string author. So what I'm doing here is using a record to represent my book in my book model, and this is what we are going to persist to the database. So I'm using Spring Data JDBC. I don't really want to get into kind of a Spring Data JDBC tutorial here, but I'm just marking this with @ID. So that's the annotation for this. This is my ID, and that's all I need for the model. So now I can come into a repository, and I can go ahead and say I want to create a book repository. And this is of type interface, and this is going to extend the CRUD repository, and this is going to be the integer is going to be the ID type. So we're going to import that. Make sure you import the right one, and that's all we need from the model and the repository standpoint. So once you have the model and the repository, we can come into our main application class and create a new bean, and I'm going to create a bean of type command line runner. So command line runner is this functional interface, and it just gives us a place where we can execute some code after the application context has been created and before the application has been run. So this is a great way or a great place to go ahead and seed some data. So I'm going to say return args, and in here I want to go ahead and add some data. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to get an instance of that book repository, because as I said, the application context has been created already. So I have a book repository, and that will get auto-wired into this method for me. So now what I could say is repository.save. So I just need a new book. And with Spring Data JDBC, I'm going to pass in null because that is going to get created by the database. We're going to say the title is Spring Boot up and running. There was 328 pages in there, and the author was Mark Heckler. So that is all I should need for that. And now we should... And you know what, just to kind of show something off, I'm going to just change this to $9.99 for now so we can see that this is coming from a different place. And let's go ahead and rerun this application. Make sure everything starts up okay, and it does. Let's head back to the H2 console. We'll connect to it, select star from book, and there is our row that got inserted via code using that command line runner. So we have a couple different ways that we can kind of insert some seed data. And again, we're using H2 as a way to either create a tutorial or a demo or a proof of concept. So this is a perfect scenario where in a proof of concept application, you may just want to seed some data. This is a good way to do so. All right, so I promised you one more thing. I want to talk about security. And if we go to our pom.xml and we go ahead and add in security. So let's add a new dependency for Spring Boot Starter Security. That is from org.springframework.boot. I'm going to save this, refresh Maven. We should pull those bits down, and we now have Spring Security on the class path. So if I were to restart this application, you would see a generated user password in here. So here's that generated user. So the first thing I would come in here and do is create a new package. We'd call this config, and we'd create a new class called security config. This class would be a configuration class. I would enable web security, and we would create a new bean called security of type security filter chain. And if you're new to kind of Spring Security or the changes that happened in Spring Security 5.7, which is basically anytime you're creating a new Spring Boot project with 2.7.x or further, I will leave a link to a video that I created on the changes with this. In the past, you might have extended a web security configure adapter. That is no longer the case. We're going to kind of take this new approach, this component-based approach. So I will leave a link to that as well. So what we need here is we need HTTP security, and we'll say HTTP. HTTP.build is what we're ultimately going to return here. All right, we're going to add the exception here. So we're going to authorize requests. We're going to say, let's go say auth. And in here, we're going to say, by default, any request, I want you to go ahead and authenticate. And we'll leave it at that. So what I want to do here is create a new controller in here. Let's create this controller. We'll call it book controller as just a way that we can kind of see some things that are going on. So it's going to be a REST controller. It's going to have a request mapping of /API/books. And in here, I'm going to get a instance of my book repository. So I can go ahead and list out all the books that are saved in our database. I'll call this repository. And actually, I want to go ahead and make this final and add a constructor parameter so we get an instance of this through constructor injection. So now I'm going to create a method that will return a list of books. And actually, it's going to return an iterable because that is the contract for the repository. We're going to import that book. We're going to call this find all. And what we're going to do is just return repository.find all. So there we go. We're going to place a git mapping on this. And what I want to do is come back to the security config and say, hey, if the MVC matcher, so we're matching an MVC pattern here. If we match API/books, just go ahead and permit all. I don't want to authenticate for that one. For whatever reason, let's just say that was left wide open. So what I want to do is go ahead and restart our application. We're still going to see that there is a user-generated security password. So the default name is user. The default password is whatever is generated here. I'm going to go back to the browser and go to localhost 8080, and we have nothing there. But if I go to, if I go to localhost 8080 and I go to /API/books, we can see that we did not have to authenticate to see that route. Now, if we are staying on localhost 8080 and we go to /h2 console, we see that we get an HTTP error 403. You don't have authorization to view this resource. Of course, we could put in something like HTTP basic with defaults. And if we restart this and we went to localhost 8080 now, it would ask us for a username and password. Okay, so in development mode, I probably don't want that, right? Like I want to be able to get to the H2 console without having to log in every single time. So your first kind of thought here might be, okay, well, I'm going to come in here and set an ant matcher for this because this is not an MVC request. This is more of an ant matcher. And I might want to go ahead and say anything to H2 console, do the same thing. Let's go ahead and permit all. So that might be your first inclination. So let's go ahead and stop and rerun this. And let's try and go to this. So far, so good. All right, we were able to at least see the login here. So I'm going to go ahead and connect. And for whatever reason, now it's asking me to go ahead and log in still, which is not the desired outcome here, right? So we need to do a couple other things. The first one is on our CSRF, our cross-site request forgery. We want to go ahead and set something here. So we're going to say CSRF.ignoring our ant matchers. So if we look at this, this is basically saying, hey, I want you to allow the specifying servlet that should not use CSRF protection, even if they match this. So we're saying, hey, ignore CSRF when you see this here. So we're going to kind of repeat this. So console ***. So let's go ahead and restart this. And if we refresh this and hit connect, we are getting closer. So we were able to log in. We didn't get the username and password, HTTP basic authentication login dialog. But now we're getting these weird things going on here. And if I look at the console, it's saying that refuse to display localhost 8080 in a frame because it set X frame options to deny. So we'll have to do one more thing in here. If we come in here, there's an X frame header. So we can say headers. Say headers dot options frame options dot same origin. So we're just saying, hey, specify to allow any request that comes from the same origin to frame this application. So if we set that and refresh this and go back to the H2 console and go ahead and connect, now we can see everything again. So that was the bits of the Spring Security stuff. If you're using Spring Security and you're using the H2 console, this will probably come up. You probably don't want to have the H2, you don't want to keep logging into the H2 console every single time the application restarts. So this is a nice little handy tip on how to go ahead and configure that so you can get into it without authentication. I hope you enjoyed that tutorial on connecting to and configuring an H2 database in Spring Boot. As always, if you found value in this video, do me a favor, friends. Leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.